Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Discussing a Murder. This is Jeff Jones, and with me is the panel. And maybe we'll go from the bottom to the top this week and start with Dr. Silkman. How are you today, Dr. Silkman?
I'm doing well, Jeff, and thank you so much. And welcome, everyone. It's great to be back.
Great to have you back. Kelly, how are you doing today?
Good morning, everyone. I'm doing very well. It's a bit chilly here in West Australia today, but it's good to be here.
Big Jeff, how's it going? Are you ready for this one?
Oh, this is going to be a doozy. I can tell you that. I can tell you that right now. It's almost going to be enough of a doozy to break out a Moscow Mule, but not quite. If you didn't catch our live, it's what's it called? Discussing a Murder of the Suspects. It was an epic live.
Suspects. Yeah, that's right. It was.
It was an epic live. Go check that one out. I go through 4 Moscow Mules in that one.
This is the beginning of episode 6 entitled Testing the Evidence.
Brendan watches Stephen Avery take a butcher knife from the kitchen and stab Teresa Halbach in the stomach. What Stephen Avery does then, while Teresa is still begging for her life, is he hands the knife to the 16-year-old boy and instructs him to cut her throat. Sixteen-year-old Brendan, under the instruction of Stephen Avery, cuts Teresa Halbach's throat, but she still doesn't die. There's additional information, which includes manual strangulation and gunshot wounds.
After obtaining the information that was obtained from Brendan, we felt that there might be areas that we needed to recheck for blood evidence for items used in the commission of these crimes. And we are searching his residence and searching the garage near his residence because we now know that the garage was part of the crime scene.
Is there any DNA evidence backing up the kid's story?
Yeah, we're not going to comment on that. We obviously have a lot of evidence, and I guess we can say that there is a substantial amount of physical evidence that now makes sense.
Truly remarkable what Mr. Kratz did for a start, doing a press conference like that on March the 2nd. And if you hear his words, you know, he gives out a narrative essentially from what Brendan Dassey had told Fassbender and Uyghur. The remarkable thing here, guys, is that Mr. Kratz talks about forensic evidence. There actually was no forensic evidence tying anything to Brendan Dassey. And this very much was a narrative from Brendan Dassey. And it's remarkable that here you have a prosecuting DA, or he's going to be a prosecuting DA, without fact-checking, essentially giving a story out to the press and scaring everybody. And the disturbing thing for me was that they had to get another search warrant to search Stephen Avery's trailer and the garage. And you have to ask yourself, how on earth did they miss any incriminating forensic evidence initially, in October, November, when they went over the garage and the trailer so many times? And as you'll see, all of a sudden, you're going to find the magic bullets in that garage. Truly disturbing when you think about it.
Well, we know that the press conference does not continue to the point where Stephen Avery eventually folds his hands like this and whispers the magic words and makes all of the blood evidence in his room disappear from stabbing her in the stomach, from stabbing her in the throat. When you make those kind of incisions and do that kind of, you cannot get rid of all the blood that happens when you do something like that. You just can't do it. And when we get to the shooting, there's no blood evidence of that. Perhaps the most important thing we saw in that last clip was the people tromping around in the snow. And as you see, maybe we can rewind it to the people tromping around in the snow. That's showing the live, sort of a live version of the search that's going on. And think back to yourselves. I know that the documentary comes a little bit out of order. So Brendan's confession that we saw now a couple of episodes ago, really from the perspective of this press conference, only happened a couple of days ago, right?
One day.
One day, March 1st, right? Think to yourself what Fassbender said to Brendan. Brendan says what they're coercing Brendan, they're forcing him to tell the story they want. What do? We took her outside and shot her. Well, that's a lie, Brendan. We know that's a lie. They didn't know jack shit, right? What they as Dr. Silkman just indicated, they found some very interesting evidence that we're going to talk a long time about today, I'm very sure, and they found it in the garage. What evidence did Fassbender know about? You heard Kratz. We now know the garage is part of the crime scene. Did they even suspect it before? They searched it. They didn't find anything. But what did they tell Brendan? When he said, we went and took her out, shot her outside. No, that's a lie, Brendan. We know it's a lie. They had to have Brendan shoot her or Stephen shoot her in the garage, because if you look back at that clip, there's about 6 inches of snow on the ground, and it's very difficult to find the planted evidence that they found in that 6 inches of snow. Why did Fassbender say this is a lie?
Correct.
Because it was a setup for what they found in the garage, and subsequently the hood lash swabs in the wrap.
Correct, 100% correct. And it's very interesting that I believe Mr. Kratz makes reference to the snow. That picture that we see with the searchers going into the garage, and the entire area is covered with snow. And he says, and I know we'll be talking about it, how could anyone possibly plant any evidence? There's snow all around the place and you don't see any footprints, right? So Big Jeff makes a very important point. Now, I understand that, and we'll talk about it, about the cranial bone fragments having bullet holes in them, beveling. So the big question is, what did Fassbender and Wiegert know that made the garage a central hotspot, right? And I think that's a very, very important question raised by Big Jeff.
And let's pose a question to the panel, since we're going to try and talk so that we don't get through any more of this episode. Since we now can look at this in perfect 2020 hindsight, what evidence exactly is Kratz talking about that they had before but didn't make sense, but now all of a sudden makes sense?
I think the answer is zero, because they actually hadn't found anything yet.
Yeah. So again, just more stream of bullshit out of his mouth. That's what you have from our good friend Ken Kratz.
But you have to admit, guys, and people listening in chat, it's remarkable that one of the journalists actually said, is there any DNA backing up the kid's story? The amount of lies coming out of Kratz's mouth is just simply unbelievable. And as we know, and as Big Jeff alluded to, hindsight is always 20/20. There was actually no DNA whatsoever that linked Brendan Dassey to Teresa Halbach. And so it was great that one of the journalists had the foresight to say, well, you've come up with this story, you've scared everybody around the world and in Wisconsin. Do you actually have any evidence to back this up? And he had the audacity to say, oh yeah, we've got plenty of forensic evidence, right? But what he didn't allude to was that he could not tie in Brendan Dassey to anything, right? And it's so shocking. But remember, this is Mr. Kratz's personality, narcissistic personality, win at all costs. If you bend the truth in the process, who cares, right?
Yeah, and I have a couple things to echo off of what you both just said. Big Jeff, you mentioned that some evidence that he didn't. He said, "Oh, it all makes sense right now," or well, he just said, unless my ears were playing tricks on me, he said evidence of manual strangulation. What? Lie? What?
Yeah, I think Brendan. It's just Brendan's. He's talking about Brendan's coerced confession as if it were evidence, and an affidavit is evidence, but I wouldn't
nice
call it
little
physical, not physical evidence.
Right, nice wordplay there. It makes it sound like you have ropes, right? It makes it sound like we have the ropes and her DNA's on the ropes. No, this is just a lie that made up. And the other part that that I know that we've talked about this before and it's been brought up ad nauseum, but the first thing out of Ken Kratz's mouth is they cut her throat, but she isn't dead.
That's actually
this earlier.
That's actually a very important point, Jeff, because remember how it pans out in the end, that you've got one victim but with two different murder scenarios, right? So the question is, if Teresa Halbach was already dead inside Stephen Avery's trailer, then what's the shooting scenario for, right? So hence, he had emphasized the fact that, she had her throat cut. I'm not sure whether he mentioned stabbing as well, stabbing in the stomach, but he emphasized, I quote, "but she did not die," right? So hence now he's pointing the direction that the death of Teresa Halbach occurred in the garage, and we'll obviously talk about the two bullet fragments that were found in the garage. So he's saying that despite, all the torture, strangulation, cutting of throat, stabbing, Teresa Halbach was still alive, right? And hence, when he said it now all makes sense. So he's now steering the investigation, so to speak, into the garage.
Exactly. I think, just the point that I wanted to make, I'm no doctor, but when you cut someone, they bleed. And I know that we've covered this 100 times, and I know we've all said this, but like, where is this blood that she was cut from, right? And that's really just the most atrocious part. It's like, it proves it's just a line of sack of shit.
I think Kelly is probably the most important person on this panel here. I'm sure she has seen some horrific injuries when people are being cut in the neck. Kelly, you want to make any comments?
Yeah, I've definitely seen my fair share of throat injuries. Yeah, listen, it's not, you don't need anyone to guess it or relay what they've seen, but of course, you cut your skin in any kind of manner, you're going to bleed. We have so many arteries in our throat that, one little nip can absolutely sever it and you will bleed out within 3 minutes. So you have to be really careful if you get your throat slashed. I've seen people that have slit their own throats to the degree of basically, emergency that they're almost decapitated themselves, and we've still managed to keep them to live. So it's not that you can't not die from it. You can, obviously, but at the same time, depending on where the cut is on the throat, you can live. But in all honesty, it doesn't matter whether this scenario she's dead or alive. It's the fact, where's the blood? You are going to bleed no matter what. And even more so, the throat, because your heart is pumping and all those little spider veins and all those arteries that I'm talking about, when that throat is cut, it actually squirts. It's insane. It goes it springs out and it just goes, and out it comes. So you would expect that mist also as well, that spray type blood to form. There's no way you'd be able to clean all that up and not miss it. You'd miss it for sure, and you'd find it. So the fact that they found no blood means They talk shit.
Yep, 100% correct, Kelly. And that really is the biggest concern, because we've all read the interrogations of Brendan Dassey, and they asked him, was there blood? He goes, oh yeah, a little bit. And was there any blood on you? And he goes, no. So you think about it, you've got the cutting of the throat, the stabbing of the stomach, and you don't find one drop of blood in that trailer, including, as Kelly alluded to, micro droplets of blood that's going to come squirting out absolutely everywhere, form a fine little mist, right? And remember, they tore Stephen Avery's bedroom apart. They took away his wood paneling. They took away the mattress. They even tore up the carpet. And Big Jeff, did Culhane find any of Teresa Horbach's DNA in that trailer?
No matter how hard she looked, she couldn't come out with any.
Yeah, a big fat zero.
The hardest thing about this case is trying to figure out, now that we've gotten Brendan Dassey out of the case, we think, unless they decide to call him on rebuttal or something, how do we deal with the fact that the jurors already know it all?
It's a clever move by them to not call Brendan in their case in chief. He's not a good witness.
Which we predicted months ago.
He's, even once he starts incriminating himself and Steve, he can't do that consistently. I mean, the story is changing dramatically every time he tells it. So they put it out there in news conferences. The public knows about it. They believe it. They think it's the last nail in Stephen's coffin. And now the state leaves us in a position of shadowboxing by not putting it in. I think our best option out of a lot of not so great options is to work in ways to disprove this story as we go without putting the story in.
So again, that press conference right there is exactly what we said in previous episodes, that it shifted the burden of proof away from the state proving Stephen was guilty first. It made Stephen need to prove that he was innocent. And that's basically what Dean just said.
Yep. And not only that, the press conference itself was just, when you think about it, how illegal it was and how many laws he actually broke. And we covered this again in our series Reading with Uncle Ken. And he said that the only thing that he regrets, the only thing, mind you, that he regretted was that press conference. But as Big Jeff alluded to, the damage has been done. It meant that everyone who had listened to that press conference has now already made up their mind that Stephen Avery is indeed guilty. And that'll probably explain Kaczynski and Michael O'Kelly and their strategy that they came forward with Brendan Dassey.
I don't think he regretted it for any other reason but for the simple fact that he regretted it because he got so much slack for it, not because it was unethical per se. And I think that he would definitely have done it again because it gave them an incredible head start. He just doesn't like the fact that so many people were disgusted by it, in my opinion. That's why he regrets it so much, because it wasn't taken the way he wanted it to be taken. Like, they sat everyone down and they informed the community. No, everyone was like, dude, that was way too far. So again, it's all about him and his narcissistic feels about how it affected him versus the fact that it was just so wrong to do.
I agree with you, Kelly. Knowing Ken Kratz, the narcissist that he is, he definitely would have done it again. He wouldn't have changed a thing. You're correct. I agree with you.
said 1826.
After we had made entry into the garage, I had done initial overall photography. We then spent some time just kind of walking around the garage looking.
Did you and other investigators begin moving items within this garage?
Yes, we basically started in the northeast corner of the garage and began to remove items to see if there was any obvious sign of potential trace evidence on them or biological evidence.
Are you telling this jury that every one of those items was handled by law enforcement and examined?
Virtually every item, yes.
Now, the question has to be asked, right? Are you honestly trying to tell me that these investigators in November, when they were in the garage many, many times, didn't do exactly what this officer is saying, i.e. move items, check for forensic evidence? Are you now trying to tell me that the light suddenly went on and they grew a conscience and they started to move items looking for potential evidence of something nefarious going on to that garage? We're talking about March. Stephen Avery has already been arrested, right? And are we talking about the fact that they're now entering the garage as if this is the first time that they're looking for forensic evidence? Guys, it honestly is a farce, right? One would have expected those officers to have done all of that back in November when they went inside that garage for the very first time.
It's absolutely ludicrus. We have the garage sign in and sign out sheets. And at one point, our friends Coburn and Link signed into the garage for a 4-hour search. So the search that was done in that garage was extensive. And to argue they're going to find something is amazing. And that's an extremely consequential photo we're looking at right now. Very notorious thing that we're looking at. The magic bullet that Dr. Silkman just alluded to a second ago. Where do you think they find it?
Yeah, and don't forget, this is months after the fact. Months after the fact, the families are now back on their property, right? So potentially anything could have been added, subtracted, whatever, right? Because they were the investigating officers were no longer on the property. And if you notice, the car's gone, the Suzuki's gone. There's another vehicle in that garage. So we know that that's not an in situ scene, as was the case back in November. So things have been altered. That's a very important point to note.
We have that. So there's, we have the pictures. As a matter of fact, we'll show one just in a little bit, I think, that I've put in Jeff's Discord that maybe he can copy over. Not quite now, but in a little bit. But that black thing right there is what they call a creeper. It's something that mechanics will use to get under cars. I've only ever seen one in Stephen's garage. So allegedly, then that would be the same creeper that Brendan Dassey says that they used to move her around.
That's 100% correct. And,
how much forensic evidence did they find of that, of Teresa on that, Tony?
A big fat zero. And, we'll get into this very, very soon, right? Considering the number of times that Teresa Horbach was shot, allegedly shot, and the mere factor that Brendan said and stated that they'd used the creeper to move her body from the garage to the burn pit. And quite clearly, they found zero blood and zero forensic evidence on that creeper. Yeah, very good point, Big Jeff.
Yeah, have you ever, if you look at the wheels on that creeper, right? If you've ever tried to move something with wheels like that over the grass, it just doesn't go very well. It just
the creeper, as soon as it hit gravel, as soon as it hit an uneven surface, it would have stopped. you use those creepers on dead straight concrete. That's the whole purpose of them.
It's not just the item FL itself. I think it's, for me, it's how Teresa's DNA got on it. Because the bullet itself, I don't think had anything to do with Teresa being shot, or anything to do with any injury or the cause of death or anything like that. I do believe that there was other, bullet fragments around, because like everyone had already spoken about, they would shoot around the property. So the fact that the bullet's there is not out of character. And let's just say for this moment that they did just miss that bullet there. My problem is, how did Teresa's DNA get on it to make it become something more than just a bullet?
If I could have the first crack at that answer, the answer to that is item FL is so obviously planted that they got a bullet from somewhere, whether they picked it up in the property, whether it was an old one, that they had, or maybe they even found it. They took it back to Dr. Silkman's girlfriend, and she wiped the DNA on it, or it was never there, and she fabricated it somehow. Item FL is so obviously planted. If there's one piece of evidence in this whole case that makes me absolutely unconditionally convinced that Stephen and Brendan are innocent, it is item FL by far. They had absolutely nothing. Their case was failing. Stephen is on the phone with his mother laughing about how bad their case is. The property bond is on its way. And literally in about 5 days from what this press conference was and when the property bond hearing was, but again, miraculously, they get a coerced confession out of Brendan, and they go into the garage. They find item FL. The press conference happens, and as a result of the confession, the bail bond is upped from $500,000 to $750,000. Stephen stays in jail, and all of a sudden the case is now solid as a rock because they find FL with Teresa's DNA, and that is what really is the only piece of evidence that puts her inside of Avery's et al. So, it is just a total. There's too many miracles in a row for me just happened, that is why it's a crock. And there's even more flakiness that we're going to get into with this bullet beyond just that timeline that I just went through. So that's how it got on there, because they put it on there.
Yep, I absolutely agree with Big Jeff and the panel. I remember watching this series for the very first time, and when they talked about item FL, I had become 100% convinced that item FL was a planted piece of forensic evidence. The importance we'll see throughout this episode and others, how the state utilized item FL to nail both Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey. Item FL was crucial in bringing some credence to what Brendan Dassey was coerced into, right? And the most important thing to remember, guys, it wasn't Brendan Dassey that ever mentioned a shooting scenario. It was, in actual fact, Wiegert. It came out of Wiegert's mouth, right? So never did Brendan Dassey ever own up to having shot Teresa Horbach in the head or anywhere else. That suggestion had come from the lead investigator himself. That's an important point to consider.
Just out of curiosity, though, gentlemen and people that are now will be listening, do you think this was a two-part frame, or do you think so? In other words, do you think that the bullet was put there already with Teresa on it, in intention that when it got to the lab, it just appeared to be the bullet of significance, or do you think that someone put it there with nothing on it, just wanted the shell of it, to then take it, and then Sherry Colhane then did her part, which would then make it a two-part source of framing, because you need 2 people in this one. You need someone to place it there, and then you need her to finish the job. Or do you think, I'm trying to phrase it so it's really clear, or someone went there with it that had already contaminated with Teresa, so by the time it got to the lab, it was already, for even Sherry Colhane, it just looked authentic that this bullet had Teresa on it. So is it 2-part, or is it just one person?
Well, I'll take a crack at that as well. And again, everything that we say is speculation. We're not accusing anybody here. But it would have been the easiest way to pull it off would be with the help of the forensics lab. So they needed there needed to be a bullet in there. So actually, maybe your story bifurcates a little bit again. Was there a bullet in there, period, and was that brought in? And secondly, was the bullet that was brought in have Teresa's DNA on it so they could find it later? I'm not exactly sure, but I think that it was much easier to pull off the things that they pulled off in this case with the help of the crime lab as opposed to without it. So my guess would be sort of closer to the latter, but it is very strange that we're going to find. I'm not sure that the evidence for this shows up. That somebody did show up during this search to bring the Hungry Men sandwiches, and that person didn't sign in. And if you look in the sign-in sheets, they actually, oh, you showed up, we're going to sign you in. It's kind of in the margins. You want to take a guess as to who that was that did that?
It was Link.
It was
Link.
He's everywhere, right?
Yeah, correct. If I could answer Kelly's question, in my opinion, definitely a 2-part. Put it this way: the mere fact that the garage and the salvage yard had thousands of spent shells, the finding of potential bullet fragments is not unusual at all, right? So that's point number 1. Point number 2: the only person who had control of Teresa Halbach's genomic DNA was Cherie Colhane. So it would have been definitely much, much easier to take the bullet to the crime lab, and Colhane either added the DNA intentionally or unintentionally through a form of contamination. The last thing you want to do is to try and risk placing a bullet under a compressor or anywhere else containing human genomic DNA. Because as we know, guys, the garage is a very dusty place, and dust contains a lot of microbes that potentially could destroy genomic DNA. So the last thing you want to do is to do a planting of a bullet containing genomic DNA on that bullet, because remember, the only source of DNA that would have had at that time would have been the pap smear, right? Because we genuinely know that pap smear had come from Teresa Halbach. So it's very, very risky to plant an object in a dusty, dirty garage, and we don't know where, when item FL was actually planted. If it indeed was planted, it could have just simply been a random bullet which they found in the garage, and they moved it under the compressor to give the guys, oh, no wonder we didn't see it all those times we're in the garage, right? Definitely easier, Kelly, to place the DNA in the laboratory. The laboratory is a clean environment, and no one is going to know that Colhane added or contaminated item FL with Teresa Halbach's genomic DNA. Definitely the safest place to do it.
I agree. I just want to, because I like to keep balance, and I like to really make sure that, whenever we cross these roads, we make sure that we bring fairness to every option. So I think it's fair in this situation when it comes to item FL. I think we're all in agreement that item FL could not have been planted by the killer. Agree?
Definitely.
Agree.
Great. So what I've been doing is I've been doing a little project of my own, and I'm trying to break down the statistics and the the possibilities of who, where, how we all sit there and say we all struggle to try to find that fine line where the crime happened and when the planting started. So that's that really fine line that none of us can really see where it all began to where it ended on one end and then began on the other. So I've been trying to record and going through every single piece of item and breaking it down to see which item or which piece of evidence falls into which category. And I've broken it up into 3 categories, which is law enforcement, killer, and lab. So every time, like for example, item FL, I've put law enforcement, killer, lab, and I've gone along and I've put a cross next to the ones that more than likely is only capable of being able to produce this evidence. I did leave the killer off this one. I've put the lab and I put law enforcement. So that's hence I asked the question, is this a 2-part? Because I came up with the same conclusion. So I just wanted to kind of clear that up. So it's just really interesting when you break it down, because I think it comes back to this. My head is like, I struggle with Kathleen's narrative, but I completely understand it. And like I said in the last episode, I'm open to everything. You have to be. But the thing that I struggle about is I find it hard to believe that I agree that there's 2 forces in this crime, in a sense. But the thing that I struggle with the fact that, she's alleging that the killer planted the RAV, the bones, and the blood, but she's not discounting the fact that law enforcement could have done the rest. I find that really hard to comprehend, that you have 2. Stephen Avery must be the most unluckiest person in the world to have 2 forces working against him at the same time, yet neither of them cross paths and basically catch each other red-handed in the middle of the framing, or they don't, or one of them doesn't work out the other one's doing it. So I'm trying to do it by this method, is trying to see if we can find that line. Will I find it? Probably not, but I just thought it was a clever way of looking at it, because if one thing's planted from the law enforcement, and I think Big Jeff makes a really perfect point, item FL is kind of like the evidence that, besides the key, that is so obviously planted that if law enforcement planted one thing, it's most likely they could have planted it all. Thoughts?
100% agree. I like your analysis, Kelly. I think that's a very logical approach. I think the best option is to put no cards on the table. We have to consider everything. And we absolutely know that 2 groups of people placed their hands on item FL. Law enforcement, the people that found it, and Cherie Culhane in the laboratory, right? And I think it was Newhouse as well, who did the bullet analysis as well. He put his hands on it as well. So we know at least 2 groups of people that had direct access to that bullet fragment, right? I don't believe the killer had placed item FL there. I believe that the bullet was used strategically in order to make the story, the coerced story of Brendan Dassey, believable. It was an instrument.
Near that compressor that you thought was interesting?
As we reached this area, I had to get onto my hands and my knees and utilized a flashlight to look under the compressor. And I saw what appeared to be a flattened bullet.
I've actually zoomed into that area. Tell the jury what we're looking at here, please.
The bullet right between the tent and the scale.
Let's look at exhibit number 270, please. Tell us what we're looking at here.
This is a medium view photograph of what was ultimately identified with marker number 23, the bullet that was found under the compressor.
Can you identify the individual in this photograph, please?
Detective Dave Remaker from Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department.
Well, who wants to take a guess as to when that picture was taken? Because we have the metadata, it's right on there.
Let me guess. November?
November the 8th. November the 8th. Wow, during the search. Now, there's the Suzuki on the left that you just talked about, the black vehicle.
Correct.
And we also talked about the snowmobile, the skidoo. That's right there as well. In the front, that's that black seat right there. But there's the green air compressor that where they find the key, the FL, excuse me. And you've zoomed away a little bit from the flashlight, which is pointed under the toolbox, which is right next to the compressor. Now, if you want to see about where they found item FL, it's the tire of the air compressor is obscuring approximately where item FL is. They have a flashlight on the ground looking under the toolbox. And maybe you can put the flashlight more in the middle of the picture of the screen. It would help everybody see exactly where that flashlight is aimed, because you can even see the sort of the aura of the light from the flashlight as to where it's aimed. And this is on November 8th, and it was the day that they relinquished the property. But there's one flashlight. It might even look like there's another green flashlight on the top of that. Is that another flashlight on the top of that thing that's making the shine?
That's a flashlight.
On the right-hand side of the bottom drawer.
Yep.
So are we to believe that item FL is right there, like right behind that tire, but we just can't see it and they didn't look for it? And we know they were searching for bullet items, shell casings. They find some, right? You look in the evidence report. They pull that stuff out of there. They were looking for that stuff. It is not believable.
They found the shell casings.
Correct.
Yes, they did. They found the shell casings. And what's remarkable, Big Jeff, that's an incredibly very good point, is that they also missed item FK, which was a mangled bullet fragment that was embedded in the concrete. So during out their extensive searches, and the other important point, Big Jeff, is that particular area near the compressor is clear. They obviously had moved items. So they had a direct, clear view from under the compressor and failed to find a bullet fragment that early on in the search.
And it's right there, right?
Correct.
Now, if we could go back to the bullet itself, I mean, a long time ago, I did a Thirsty for Thursday theory on the Foul Play channel with a gentleman who used to have a YouTube channel named Making Two Murderers, Andrew Whitehead. And we talked extensively about this. And since that time, I've got my own license to carry a firearm. If we could go back to the picture of the bullet itself, that bullet is what's known as a hollow point bullet. One of the reasons why it was invented was to prevent shooting your own people in a crossfire. That way, a bullet wouldn't go all the way through somebody and come out. But we're to believe in this circumstance that this hollow point bullet, which is meant to expand on impact, somehow managed to go all the way through Teresa Hallback, which is extremely unlikely in the first place, and embed itself somewhere so that it could fall out during this other thing that they haven't quite talked about yet, and end up under that compressor, or just sit under that compressor. The fact that this is a hollow point bullet, it makes it extremely unlikely that if it entered something, that it ever left, especially a skull. And we know the state's expert said that it entered her skull, right? Now he may have been telling what is a porky. It might have been a porky on his part, but if you shoot somebody with a hollow point bullet, it's meant to stay in them. And any other conjecture is, I get, how many miracles do I need to pull up? Well, maybe it was just he shot a point. We're talking about point blank. You don't miss point blank, right? You don't miss. Sorry.
No.
Very unlikely that went through all the way. Sorry.
Well, correct. That's a very, very good point. And, we're meant to believe that this particular bullet, this is the scenario that the state were pushing, and were very devious in the way they talked about item FL. We're meant to believe that this bullet was the instrument of death that had struck Teresa Halbach either at the back of the head or on the left side of her temple, went through her brain, didn't pick up any tissue, blood, or any type of debris or bone fragments, as we'll get to hear, and somehow magically lodged itself under a green compressor. And Big Jeff, you forgot to mention, there's no dust on that bullet at all, despite the investigators jackhammering the garage floor. That bullet appears to be dust-free. Now, as you know, dust is an enemy of DNA, right? If you leave something like that hanging around, potentially bacteria, fungi, and other chemicals present, they're going to be the enemy of DNA and destroy the DNA. And of course, as we'll get to hear in a minute, Shariko Haim was able to obtain a robust genomic DNA profile belonging to Teresa Halbach. That there was oh God, that's another Pam of God moment.
Yeah. So now that you brought up the jackhammering, let's debunk a guilter theory, right? So the guilters will say that, well, let me take even a step further back. The reason that they jackhammered the concrete is because there were stories of, in Brendan's coerced confession, he says there was a lot of blood on the garage floor, and obviously you have that much blood, it must have seeped into the plates where the floor, the floor plates of concrete sort of are laying, right? There's seams in the concrete for heat expansion. So it must have flowed in there, right? So they jackhammered it up and had that tested, because there's no way, however much you clean, that you could get to that blood in between this concrete seams there, right? They never found any. But the guilter theory is, what happened was that bullet lodged itself in the wall, and it was the jackhammering that actually unlodged it from the wall.
In that Kathleen Zellner had employed Luke Haig, who's a ballistics expert, and he had fired .22 rounds into bovine scapulars of the same thickness as a human skull. And he put ballistic gel between two bovine plates. What he discovered was the shooting of .22 bullets into the bovine scapulars, the bullet lost energy immediately. In other words, it was very, very rare that it had enough penetration power to go through the skull and out again. Now, the state are trying to say that, this bullet had gone through Teresa Halbach, no problems, in, out, must have bounced off the concrete on a bulletproof tarp, and then it lodged itself into a wall, right? Complete and utter garbage, because as soon as that bullet enters into something like the cavity, like a human skull, it loses energy. It doesn't have enough penetration power to come out. And lo and behold, we see an almost intact bullet found months after the fact underneath a compressor. And you trying to tell me that the jury didn't go, that doesn't look right? Clearly, there's something fishy going on with item FL.
I don't recall that the defense put up any bullet expert either that talked about the hollow point nature of that bullet and any of the things that we just talked about. I mean, how could they miss that?
No, they didn't.
Isn't it also fair to just highlight the fact that the ground was dusty from when they drilled all the concrete, yet this bullet had no dust on it, no specks, so it was almost placed on top after the fact. If we were to believe that it was there in the entire time and they just missed it, you would expect to see the same dust/concrete dust on top of it, right? I think that's come up a lot throughout the years, that the fact that is a quite obvious issue.
the only way that bullet is going to be essentially dust-free is if it's embedded in a wall, right? Protected from the dust. And so, the potential theory is that the jackhammering could have caused vibration to have dislodged that bullet from a wall. But the key question is, do we actually know that there were bullet holes in the garage walls? And the answer is yes. Kathleen Zellner actually had taken photographs of the garage wall, and there was proof positive of bullet holes, bullet strikes coming from outside to inside, that someone, likely Roland Johnson, had fired .22 bullets into the garage, and it lodged itself into the wall, or could have gone right through the wall, because it wasn't a solid garage. It was made out of wood paneling. So the question is there a bullet hole nearby, or was that bullet picked up from one location and placed underneath the compressor, right? So one way that bullet can be dust-free is if it's lodged within a wall and protected from the dust.
Can you identify the individual in this photograph, please?
Detective Dave Remiker from Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department.
November 6th, I think that's the first time you actually searched the garage rather than simply sweeping through it to look for Ms. Halbach.
Yes, I believe so.
You folks found some empty shell casings for, looked like 22 caliber rounds.
Yes,
10 of these, something like that?
I think 11.
11
I believe so.
on the floor.
Yes,
Where there are shell casings, there may be bullets.
we found shell casings.
Were you looking for bullets?
We were looking for everything.
Found no bullets in the search on November 6th of the garage.
Correct.
Found no bullets any other time in Stephen Avery's garage, anytime in November 2005.
Correct.
It was March 2, 2006, and you were present when one bullet fragment was found in that garage.
Correct.
Again, March 1 and 2. You were physically present both days.
Yes.
Did you see Lieutenant Link there on site at the Avery's on either day?
In March?
Yes. March 1 and March 2.
Yeah, he was there. He was, he was there.
Both days?
I believe so. Yes.
By March, why do you need any of the Manitowoc people? You've got 2 people charged with this. You're searching one garage and one trailer. That's it. And you have a well-established team of people outside Manitowoc County who now are intimately familiar with this investigation. You need Manitowoc County investigators for what? For what? On March 1st and March 2nd.
This is something that really we have to mention, right? We're talking about here about impropriety, right? There's been a lot of criticism by Gilters and Ken Kratz, et cetera, saying, why are you picking on these fine officers? Well, the reason why there's so much controversy here is because the MTSO officers are appearing at places that they have no business being at. I don't know whether they were handing out hot dogs or whatever, but really, what are MTSO officers doing in that garage, right? When you consider that they're trying to appear clean, no controversy, let it all up to Calumet, don't get involved, and yet time after time, when key pieces of forensic evidence are being found, you find MTSO officers. And here's another example of Lenk appearing again. Simply crazy.
Now, this search is the search where a couple of bullet fragments were discovered, right?
Yes.
5 months after the previous searches. 4 months. I keep my math's bad, I guess. 4
Yes.
months? Okay. What was it? 5 entries to his garage the week of November 5th to the 12th?
Correct.
At that time, though, none of the investigators knew that there would be evidence that suggested that perhaps Teresa Halbach had actually been shot in the head. That information came later,
Correct.
shortly before this March 1st and March 2nd search.
I don't know. I'm not sure when that information came.
And what I'm talking about here is by March 1st and March 2nd of 2006, which are important dates in this investigation. You know that, right?
Yes.
Additional search warrants were issued, right?
Yes.
And by that time, through all of your investigation, you had found no physical evidence linking Teresa Halbach to Mr. Avery's trailer or garage, right up to February 28th.
I don't believe that's accurate.
What'd you find?
We found shell casings in the garage that did match up to a rifle in the house.
I mean, you found shells all over the place, 40 acres, right?
Oh, certainly, yes.
Junkyard. These people were sighting rifles, you knew that, shooting rabbits. The mere existence of shells without a link to a particular body doesn't prove anything, does it?
It could have been, we just know. We didn't know.
Okay. So in short then, by March 1st and March 2nd, when those search warrants were issued, 4 months of investigation had found not one shred of Teresa Halbach's DNA anywhere in Mr. Avery's trailer or garage.
Correct.
Thank you.
Do you remember on that first search, a note with Ms. Halbach's phone number being seized from Mr. Avery's computer table?
Yes, I do.
You recall now that that was seized on November 5th?
Yes.
Would you say that that is some evidence that is obviously linked to Ms. Halbach?
Yes.
Also found on Mr. Avery's computer table was a bill of sale. You recall that now being seized on the 5th of November, don't you?
Yes, I do.
Let me ask you, Mr. Fossbender, do you know how many items of physical evidence were seized in this case alone, the Avery homicide investigation?
Upwards of 970.
Can you remember all 970 items of evidence that were seized?
No, I can't.
What the hell was Kratz going on about? The fact that they found a bill of sales and a book pertaining to Teresa Halbach's visit. Stephen Avery never denied the fact that Teresa Halbach came to the property, took a photograph of the van, and she gave him a book, right? How in the hell does that mean that Teresa Halbach was inside Stephen Avery's trailer? I can't believe that Strang and Buting simply didn't ask the judge, look, strike that comment. You're wasting people's time here, right? I can't believe how Ken Kratz continuously goes off on a tangent all the time. That discussion with Fassbender made absolutely no sense whatsoever.
Correct. What does the bill of sale prove? So Stephen, like you said, Stephen admitted she came. He claims that bill of sale was from a previous time, not this time, because he was happy with the service that he got. He didn't want the extra paper. So, but let's suppose he's lying, right? And he did have a bill of sale. Ooh, yeah. How's that prove anything again? It just doesn't. And that we don't know in that writing they didn't forensically analyze that writing on that pad for anything. And we know, for example, also, I mean, let's talk about that was indeed her mobile number on that pad. It was beneficial for Teresa for Stephen having that number because sometimes she came there under the behest of Auto Trader, but also she came there sometimes with something called a hustle shot, which is a photo shoot that is done outside the auspices of Auto Trader. And the thing about a hustle shot is that she makes more money when she does the hustle shot versus the commission she has to pay Auto Trader for those other shots. So, it's not surprising that, given that she was at the salvage yard so many times, that she gave Stephen her mobile number. To me, it doesn't prove a damn thing that he has it, except that Teresa was, if anything, was probably pissed at him that he didn't call that number directly rather than through Auto Trader, so she could have made more money on that shot. It doesn't prove a damn thing.
And it was, yes, very good point, Big Jeff. And it was Teresa Horbach that gave Stephen Avery her contact number. And Big Jeff is correct. When Teresa Horbach did hustle shots, she received much more income, right, than when she was taking a shot on behalf of Auto Trader. So there's nothing nefarious at all, right? Simply crazy. Oh, and the other point I want to point out is that it was Dr. Eisenberg that had phoned the investigator, Tom Fassbender, to inform him of the beveling in the cranial bone fragments. So and I believe it was around about the time that they were talking to Brendan. And that now made sense, the introduction of Who Shot Her in the Head by Wiegert. So Dr. Eisenberg had analyzed the cranial bone fragments. She had got them x-rayed. There were unusual openings, so to speak, in the cranial bone fragments that were due to bullet strikes. So Fassbender and Wiegert knew that the victim had been shot in the head at least twice. And that all coincided from the time they were questioning Brendan.
None of those exhibits ever show that Teresa was inside the trailer, do they?
No.
Thank you. That's all I have.
That's evidence that Bobby provided, isn't that right?
That's correct.
That's all I've got. Thank you, Judge.
I object
did
to
he
strike
say?
the question and the answer because it's not the testimony. None of those exhibits ever show that Teresa was inside the trailer, do they?
No.
Thank you. That's all I have.
That's evidence that Bobby provided, isn't that right?
That's correct.
That's evidence that Bobby provided. Is that what he said?
That's what he said.
That's right.
Yes. I think he was referring to the fact that Teresa was walking towards Stephen Avery's trailer.
Yeah.
But that
That's
doesn't
what I'm
relate.
taking.
It doesn't relate. I mean, think it through. That doesn't prove that she wasn't in the trailer. Bobby didn't provide that evidence. Ken Kratz is just panicking. It doesn't make any sense. There's no logic in that. I can't find it. If you can, explain it to me.
No, I think the implications were that Teresa Horbach had a book in her hands and was walking to give it to Stephen in his trailer as an explanation of how that booklet, the Auto Trader booklet, got inside Stephen's trailer near his computer. It's an alternative suggestion.
I object, move to strike the question and the answer because it's not the testimony. Bobby Dassey never said he saw her in the trailer.
I'm going to sustain the objection. I think it's beyond the scope of redirect.
Not the falsity, right? Right. The fact that he's saying that she's walking towards the trailer is not conclusive proof that she ever went into it. That's not the reason he's sustaining it. Sustaining because it's outside of the scope of redirect.
You mean it's hearsay, Big Jeff? Hearsay?
Easy there, killer. It's an incorrect conclusion to be drawn. I mean, it's just it's not the logical. It's not the illogic of the conclusion, right? That he's sustaining the objection on. But he's not telling the jury, no, you can't draw that conclusion from Bobby's testimony. He's saying, oh, that's outside the scope of redirect. So what message is that sending the jury? well, maybe Bobby did. You can draw that conclusion from what Bobby said, right?
Correct.
There's some subtleness there to me.
Correct. And Bobby Dassey never says that he saw Teresa Halbach with any type of book or anything like that. So, the inference that Kratz wants you to think about is the fact that she had delivered the Auto Trader magazine to Stephen inside his trailer. That's what he's trying to suggest.
The judge is in. You want me to hang your coat? I can take your coat. Go ahead.
Court is already in session. It's real quiet.
This is the top of the left eye socket, the top of the right eye socket, the left nasal bone. We also have the entire right cheekbone, as well as a portion of the left cheekbone and a portion of bone that continues over and above the opening for the left ear.
All right. And the next photograph?
This is Exhibit 384, a sampling of skull fragments. 2 fragments in particular showed defects or unnatural openings. This semicircular defect here that has another smaller unnatural opening here.
Was there anything else about this defect that was unusual?
The cranial bones were taken for x-ray, and what I'd like to call your attention to are these flecks called radio-opaque particles.
What does the presence of the internal beveling coupled with the localized radiopaque particles signify to you?
What those defects look like signifies what happens to skull bone when it's subjected to a gunshot.
There's been a lot of controversy about those cranial bone fragments. Later on, if you could put the picture back up where she actually shows the bones, the cranial fragment bones. Are you able to put that picture back up? The ones that are burnt. Just before that one. Yep, see there? Let me explain. So what you're actually seeing here is the inside of the skull. The inside of the skull. Do you see that like tree branch like structure there? They're actually the channels of blood vessels, right? So you're actually seeing on the inside of the skull. Now, if you have a look at the top right-hand corner, you see a small little semicircle right on the top. And then on the inside, you see a much larger semicircle. So this, and in the middle, that's the bone. That's the cranial bone. Your cranial bone fragments, or your cranium, is made up of 2 plates, an outer plate and an inner plate, and you've got bone matter in between. So your cranium is actually quite thick, very dense. So what that shows is when the bullet strikes skull, it leaves a much smaller hole on the outside and a much larger hole or defect on the inside. So essentially you get a blasting out effect of bone fragments as the bullet enters into the skull. So that picture you're seeing, it's only a small fragment, but it shows a small hole on the outside of the skull table and a much bigger hole on the inside of the skull. But note, they don't have a complete hole. They've only got a partial hole, but clearly that fragment shows beveling. That's diagnostic of a bullet strike. And the picture that shows the X-ray, if you could bring that up again, Jeff. Okay, so essentially that's the same thing. the same cranial bone fragment. That's been shown from the inside of your skull. And those tiny little white dots, those little flecks, that's lead. So in other words, when a bullet transits the skull, it can actually leave part of its coat behind, embedded in the bone. And as you can see, you have the lead flakes in the same spot where you have the beveling. That's classic and diagnostic of a bullet strike.
The question I want to ask is that, is the bullet item FL, is it considered pristine? Because how can you have it both ways? How can it leave lead and explode and be in one piece?
Right.
I rest my case.
Correct. And as you'll discover, and as the audience probably already knows, item FL never struck bone, and it most certainly didn't strike skull. And item FL is not the instrument of death of Teresa Halbach. It's a no-show.
Because what you're showing me here is a characteristic of potentially a hollow point, showing explosion on impact and making maximum damage. And what you're showing me with item FL is a bullet that did not strike something like that and create maximum damage.
Correct. And the amazing thing, I believe it was Kenneth Olson, he did not do elemental analysis of item FL. In other words, he did not prove that item FL was the bullet fragment or the bullet that had left that lead fragment or lead flakes in the bone. Believe it or not, the state did not do that analysis. And it's pretty obvious why. Because if they couldn't link item FL to those cranial bone fragments, then a key piece of forensic evidence just went down the toilet. So they left it open. It was a conjuring trick done by Ken Kratz and the state to give the illusion that the instrument of death of Teresa Halbach in that garage was item FL and potentially item FK. It was a dirty, dastardly trick, and it worked.
I just have one more fast question for Dr. Silkman. How big is that bone fragment? If you put a quarter down, is it bigger than $1, smaller than $1, smaller than a quarter?
It's probably no more than about an inch. They're very, very small. And Dr. Eisenberg showed you all those cranial fragments, right? You got to understand that only recovered, I believe, about 35% of the skull. They don't know where the rest of the skull bone fragments are. But remember, they showed you, Dr. Eisenberg showed you the facial bones, part of the nose, part of the jaw. A lot of the skull was actually missing. And Dr. Eisenberg had to try and reconstruct the skull and put it back together again. She wasn't very successful at doing that. But from the skull fragments that she observed, the cranial bone fragments that she observed, she was able to work out that Teresa Halbach, or the victim, if you don't believe it was Teresa Halbach, was shot once in the back of the head and once near the left temple. And you can tell because the skull has got a characteristic curve to it. So you can actually match, like a Lego piece, where those fragments actually come from. But Big Jeff, you're correct. Those bone fragments are very small. It's almost as though the whole skull had completely shattered or had been hit with some heavy metal object, because the whole skull is fragmented. But they only found 35% of the skull. They don't know where the rest of it is.
Yeah, just a good point to clarify that if you burn a skull, does it crack apart like that, or does cracking apart come from, another blunt force trauma?
Yes. So normally what happens, and I've seen actual videos of this, when they cremate a human body inside a professional crematorium, the person attending the cremation has to use a large metal bar to crunch up bones, because the skull is that, and also the ribs, believe it or not, and the spinal column are actually very hard bones to burn. So after the cremation event, the skull and other large bones are crunched with a metal bar in order to break them down. So as you can see, no intact skull was found. The skull that they recovered, allegedly from the burn pit, was in all tiny bone fragments, which is truly remarkable when you think about it.
Have an opinion as to the manner of death of this individual.
The manner of death in this case was by homicidal violence.
What kind of answer is that?
I'm glad you brought that up, Big Jeff, because it's like,
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. Like, what is she? She threw herself in the fire and chopped herself up and shot herself in the head. Like, come on now.
Well, isn't it important to know, depending upon which suspect that you're trying to try here, whether her death was by getting stabbed in the stomach, or whether it was by getting cut in the throat, or shot in the head, or shot 5 other times in other places before she was shot twice in the head. Why don't you say, well, I don't know what the conclusive killing blow was. There's so much.
If I could be a little bit cheeky here, I think she was trying to imply that Teresa Halbach didn't shoot herself twice in the skull. So it had to be by homicide. Don't worry. There's been some strange deaths in the past where, someone's put a shotgun 3 times in their skull, and the coroner said, "Oh yeah, it was deemed a suicide," right? So quite clearly here. Don't worry, there's some real strange stuff going on, but I think the impression is that it wasn't Teresa Halbach herself that had shot herself twice in the skull. It was due to homicidal violence.
I told you at the beginning of this case that we would be presenting not only cause of death, but manner of death. And when the jury has to put this whole puzzle together, the expert opinions by people like Leslie Eisenberg should all go a long way towards them making their final conclusion as to who it was who caused the death of Teresa Halbach.
Can we talk for a second? I wonder, Dr. Silkman, if you know any stories about how the competency of the expert Dr. Eisenberg, and how she might have done, in a case against somebody you mentioned earlier named Sean Rudy, and what he accused him of.
Oh boy! Well, Sean Rudy. This is an incredibly very sad case, but I'll get straight to the point. Parts of Pristine Rudy were found in a burn pit, right? So this case here is remarkably similar to what happened to Pristine Rudy. Pristine Rudy was shot in the head by her husband, Sean Rudy. He took her body, put her in a tarp, and brought her back to his mother-in-law's house or mother's house. He chopped up his wife, dismembered his wife, burnt part of his wife in a burn pit, and the rest of his wife he threw in the Chippewa River, her torso. Now, what is interesting is that in that particular case, the forensic anthropologist was none other than Leslie Eisenberg. She examined the burnt cremains found in the burn pit, where parts of Pristine Rudy lay, and she drew the conclusion that some of the bones present in that burn pit were human fetal bones, right? Human fetal bones. Well, it turned out a few months later that they found the torso of Pristine Rudy. It had washed up on the shore after the river had thawed out. When they did an autopsy, they found an intact fetus inside the torso, which meant that our Dr. Leslie Eisenberg misclassified human fetal bones. They were in actual fact animal bones. So that was a major, major faux pas by Dr. Leslie Eisenberg. So I think in this particular case, Dr. Eisenberg was extremely cautious about not drawing any conclusions, especially about the cut, burnt human cremains found at the Manitowoc County gravel pit. She refused to classify them as human. And mind you, Mr. Kratz called Dr. Eisenberg the smartest woman he had ever seen. Unbelievable.
It's relevant here because it's right at the heart of one of the previous motions, right? The bones, right? We know that the bones were given away, and Zellner wanted to test the bones because her argument was that the primary burn site was not Stevens burn pit, but it was somewhere else, and some collection of bones was brought back and thrown into his burn pit area. So she wanted to test some of those. And the state argued that this wasn't convincing because those bones were never identified by the forensic expert as human, only possible human. So this is Leslie the liar Eisenberg, who can't tell the difference between animal bones and fetus bones. But when it's good for the state, when it's going to help, add to Sean Rudy's, horror because he cut the baby out, then it's perfectly fine. But she is somehow unable to identify these bones from elsewhere as definitively human bones, right? Won't do.
Correct. And the horror of all of this, as we'll discover, is that all Dr. Eisenberg had to do, now wait for it, was place the bones underneath a microscope. And she didn't even do that, right? And one of the roles of a forensic anthropologist is to determine the difference between human and animal cremains, especially in a murder trial, right? So the FBI was able to establish that those so-called human fetal bones were in actual fact animal, and they did that using antibodies. Yet, here is a classic case in which Dr. Eisenberg refused to classify those cremains at the Manitowoc County gravel pit, especially the pelvic bones. I believe she was under instruction not to do so and kept it open.
I would ask if Detective Wiegert would bring you Exhibit 237. And can you identify that exhibit that's in front of you, Ms. Colleen?
Yes. This is Crime Lab item designation FL, and it is a lead bullet fragment.
And how did you process that bullet?
In order to remove any residual DNA that might have been on the bullet, I washed it. I put it in a test tube and washed it with some buffer that we use to extract the DNA. And the liquid is what I performed the rest of my procedure on.
And were you able to develop a DNA profile from that washing on item FL, the bullet?
Yes.
Do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty whether Teresa Halbach is the source of the DNA on item FL, the bullet?
Yes, I believe she is the source of the DNA on the bullet.
Well, Dr. Silkman, we've been waiting a long time for this moment, and it has finally arrived, the introduction of Sherry Colhane.
Yeah, I'll keep it very brief. The important thing is this. Now, normally what a lab technician actually does is they do a presumptive test for blood, right? That's the very first thing that they do. So they do a swab. So say they got the bullet. Normally what they do is they look for the evidence of blood or some type of stain on that piece of forensic evidence. And the reason why they do a presumptive test is to prove the presence of blood. If they do a presumptive test and it comes positive for the presence of blood, then they do another subsequent swab and do a DNA extraction. And the reason why they do a presumptive test is to prove that it contains some type of biological material present on that item to extract genomic DNA from. You notice what Culhane actually does in this case. She does not do a presumptive test, and we'll discover later on it's because when she observed the bullet, she saw no evidence of tissue or blood on that item, yet she still processed it for DNA. Isn't that remarkable? Normally they do a presumptive test. And you know what's even more incredible? I don't believe a presumptive test was done on the key either. So she decided to swab the key and try and extract genomic DNA from a bullet that she saw no evidence of any biological material on. It begs the question, why? And the reason why is because those two crucial pieces of evidence do exactly what Fassbender had asked Culhane to do. Try to put her in his trailer or garage. Now, how does Culhane explain washing the bullet and utilizing all of the DNA from that bullet, and she used all of the DNA from the key? Why is that significant? It means that no one else can go back and re-extract DNA from the key or the bullet. Gone.
But Dr. Silkman, was that in and of itself a deviation from normal procedure, using all of the, washing it to use all the DNA? I mean,
you can
go irregular.
Correct. You can go to any laboratory manual, especially in a forensics laboratory. What you'll find is that normally you keep at least half the sample. You preserve half the sample. You never utilize the entire lot, because if you make a mistake, say the machine broke down, or you've got a bad batch of chemicals and you don't get a result, a forensic result, you've got no recourse to go back and take another DNA sample and do another PCR analysis. She took the gamble on item FL and utilized the entire sample. That's a forensic no-no, Big Jeff. You always keep at least 50% of the sample just in case.
Just in case, like maybe fail the negative control?
Correct. And to her horror, that's exactly what happened with item FL. I call that karma, Big Jeff. I call it karma. And this got the crime lab and Cherie Culhane in a lot of hot water. Same with the state.
Match differ in any way from the previous matches that you called?
Yes, it did.
And could you explain to the jury what happened?
When we began the extraction, we began what's called a manipulation control. And it's basically a negative blank control. And it helps us monitor if any unintentional DNA is introduced into the sample. During the extraction procedure, I inadvertently introduced my own DNA into the negative control.
Did that have any impact on your interpretation of your results?
It did not have any impact as far as the profile from the evidence sample.
Do you notice the hesitation in her answer? She knew. She absolutely knew, oh boy, I'm going to tell a big porky lie. Now, she is correct. It did not affect the test result because the contamination potentially was not in the test result. it was in the PCR negative control. What she should have said, I can't draw any conclusion to my analysis because I've introduced my own DNA into the PCR negative control. Her true answer should have been, I needed to throw out all my results and restart the experiment again. But Norm Garn asked some very clever strategic questions to get around that inconvenient fact.
It's just the fact that I introduced my own DNA into the manipulation control.
And how do you think your DNA profile got into that control?
I believe my DNA profile was introduced during the extraction procedure when I was talking. I was training 2 newer analysts, so I was explaining to them what I was.
Sorry, but I've been waiting for this moment for a long time. Who the hell is training people when you have this high-profile case? Whether it's high-profile or not, whatever. You know it's for Stephen Avery. You know the story.
You never.
You train people?
You
On
never.
a real live murder case?
Yep. You never, ever let anyone else come near the samples of DNA that you are extracting and where you're doing a PCR experiment. Culhane knows that PCR is so sensitive. Even a few cells that contaminate either a tube, a solution, or a piece of equipment is enough to amplify up your own DNA. And to make matters worse, Dean Strang and Buting discovered that the Wisconsin State Crime Lab had a contamination log, right? So every time they got a contamination event, they had to recall it, right? Record it down. It just so happened that Cherie Culhane had the highest contamination record in the laboratory. Yep, it's true she did most of the DNA analysis, but you know what was disturbing? Some of the cases of contamination, to this day, they cannot explain how someone's DNA that had nothing to do with the case that they were working on got extracted and amplified. To me, that suggests that the Wisconsin State Crime Lab had an incredible contamination problem. The mere fact that Culhane had contaminated her PCR negative controlled tube indicated that she had a contamination event at her bench. That's a red flag, guys. That tells you that you cannot trust the test result of the bullet right then and there.
So suppose Dr. Silkman, she was attempting to, make a submission to a technical paper, and she had contaminated the negative control. You think she'd be writing this stuff down in the paper and having peer reviewed results?
Okay, now this I can talk about. I have 14 publications myself. And they've been internationally refereed in scientific journals. I'll tell you right now, if you presented this information to a laboratory meeting, let alone a paper, your immediate supervisor will chew your ass and throw you out of the lab, right? You cannot present any data if your controls are contaminated. There is no scientific paper in the world that will ever accept a test positive result, when the negative control has been contaminated. It's like you going for a test for, say, a cancer, a particular type of cancer, and your physician saying, I'm sorry, I've got bad news. The test results show that you have cancer. Oh, by the way, our control sample was stuffed up and it didn't give us the result that we wanted. Do you trust my result of the cancer test? That is what this bitch said in court. Trust my results. Don't worry about the negative control. the item FL result containing Teresa Horbach's DNA is true and there's nothing to worry about. And to make matters worse, Norm Garn, who's meant to have a scientific background, backed her up regarding the validity of the test result, and we can ignore the PCR negative control contamination. Mind blowing. It's like this. I'll tell you right now, and Kelly will back me up. In Australia, someone was putting needles in strawberries, right, at the supermarket. They were putting needles in strawberries. And as soon as a needle was discovered, do you think they just took away that offending packet of strawberries and said, oh, don't worry, we can assume that the rest of the strawberries were fine? No, they threw out every packet of strawberries and got brand new fresh ones, because once you've got a source of contamination, you cannot trust anything else. Culhane was trying to pull the wool over everybody's eyes to say, don't worry about the negative PCR control, the test result was fine. I, as a former scientist, cannot believe what I heard and what I read in her testimony. Thank you.
I just want to put a spin on the strawberry twist. Not if Dr. Silkman's right, I'll never forget it. I do remember that happening. The strawberries, there was a needle. Every strawberry in Australia got pulled, basically. Here's the catch. Excuse me. When the strawberries came back, a person then planted another needle in their own strawberries and then tried to sue and pretend that it was happening again. Keyword, they planted it themselves. So I just thought that would be a little bit ironic, being the fact that we have that parallel of Sherry Culhane on the stand talking about contamination and doing this, yet she planted the DNA herself. Dr. Silkman brings up the strawberries, strawberry gets pulled, yet we have another planting situation even with strawberries.
That's 100% correct. But you see the irony here, guys, and that is Strang and Buting had written a letter to say, we want to go into the Wisconsin State Crime Lab and observe the forensic analysis of the evidence. The Wisconsin State Crime Lab wrote back and said, you can't come into this laboratory. Big Jeff, do you remember the reason why they didn't want anyone coming into the crime lab?
Because they might contaminate the evidence.
Correct. 100% correct. They were told you can't come into the lab because of fear of contamination. And now, are we meant to believe, Sherry Culhane, that the most important piece of forensic evidence in this trial, item FL, while she was extracting item FL, she was teaching students? Come on. You got to think of a better excuse than that. If you've ever seen a PCR being done, PCR is extremely super sensitive, right? Even touch DNA, you can potentially amplify it up. So when you do a DNA extraction from a piece of forensic evidence, you do it in one room. You could normally do it at your bench, but everything has to be scrubbed down and cleaned. Then you take the sample and you do PCR in another location in the lab, the clean area, where there's no potential for contamination to take place. Under no circumstances do you bring somebody with you to observe the PCR procedure. You teach somebody using samples that make no difference whether they're contaminated or not, right? You do a trial run, you show a group of students. I've done this many, many times, but you're not going to produce that piece of evidence in a court. You're teaching somebody the technique. You use samples that you don't care whether they're contaminated or not. You're showing the procedure. But when it comes to key pieces of forensic evidence that can put someone in prison for life, God damn it, you want to make sure that you do the very best you can, that you're not showing the techniques to a group of students, especially handling important items of forensic evidence. How Culhane wasn't fired on the spot, to this day, I've got no idea.
Here's a demonstration for you students. Don't do it like this.
I wonder if it was all part of the show, right? Because, we have this item FL. If the people on this panel are quite convinced that item FL is planted. So you ask, well, if FL was planted, how could the state have fucked this up so bad? Well, she washed all the DNA off of it to make sure that it could not be used again by somebody else. And we talk about that like it's an accident when it's clearly on purpose. And not only did she do that, she puts on the show of exactly how she's going to do it in front of other people. So if the other people ask, well, there's any irregularity about the way she performed the test, all of a sudden now she's got these two witnesses that say, oh, well, I did this in front of two other people and they didn't see anything funny. But as was been pointed out, to her horror, it comes back that she screwed up the negative control, and all bets are off because there is no other item but FL to do that test on. So, oops.
Correct. It was essentially a one-off experiment, and she fucked it up.
I was doing, and as I was setting it up, and apparently I felt as if I was far enough away from my workbench not to introduce my DNA, but apparently I was incorrect.
That manipulation control is designed to catch a mistake that was made.
Correct.
So does that mean, though, that a mistake couldn't have been made with the fragment itself? That's my question.
No,
do you feel like you cleared that?
Isn't that a lie right there? I'm sorry to stop it so quickly, but isn't that a lie?
Correct. Every scientist, from someone in high school to someone who's got a PhD or a professor, will be absolutely mortified with the crap that's coming out of Garn's mouth right now. Mortified.
Clear that up then.
Yes. I think it's clear that the profile on the bullet was Teresa Halbach's, and the fact that there was the contamination and Sherry Culhane's DNA profile was in the control had nothing to do with the DNA profile on the bullet.
I'm not wording this properly, I'm sorry. I mean that Teresa's DNA couldn't have somehow just got swapped on there in the lab. Do you understand what I'm saying? On the fragment.
Do you understand what I'm saying? The reporters got you already.
Now that's truly remarkable. I don't believe this lady has got a molecular biology background. Correct me if I'm wrong, but she had the gumption to understand that there was something seriously wrong with item FL. So essentially, she's basically saying, "Hey, look, if Sherry Culhane had introduced her own DNA inside the PCR negative control, what's to suggest that somehow Teresa Halbach's DNA didn't accidentally get introduced into the bullet tube that she had extracted the DNA from item FL?" So she is 100%. If your control is contaminated, you can't trust the test.
So you've told me many times, I think, Dr. Silkman, that Sherry Culhane kept Teresa's genomic profile at her desk as well, right? Up in her cabinets.
Yeah, and also I've read the report in which Sherry Culhane reports item FL, the genomic DNA profile of item FL. In that very same report, she extracts genomic DNA from the inner door handle of the RAV4, which happened to be touch DNA belonging to Teresa Halbach, which meant that at some stage, Sherry Culhane was handling the genomic DNA of Teresa Halbach at her bench. To everyone's horror, Buting proved that Sherry Culhane had kept the genomic samples and swabs in her workbench. At her workbench, which meant that the chance of contamination was extremely, extremely high. So instead of getting a forensic sample, extracting the DNA, and then returning it to the proper location where the forensic samples are meant to be kept, she kept the swabs in a cupboard at her workbench, which meant every time she went to the cupboard to do whatever, the chance of contamination is much, much higher, right? So she broke all the laboratory protocols at her workbench. And because they've got a contamination log, it proved that despite her cleaning her bench surfaces, you can still get DNA contamination. DNA can be aerosolized. It can be in the air, right? So even when you think you've cleaned the surface, it can still be around you, right? That's why you do controls, and that's why controls are there to protect you and the reputation of the laboratory. So when you get a control that's contaminated, guys, it's easy. You throw everything out, you do the experiment all over again. Culhane could not do that. She had used up all the DNA in one experiment.
Fragment. You know, that mistake made.
No, that mistake
You know
was
what I
not made. I know what you're saying. That mistake was not made.
When we argued, by the way, in last March and filed a motion and said, we want fair forensic testing. All we want is someone to be there to observe this. They opposed it. They said, no, we don't want anybody in our, oh, there's so much more potential for contamination. That's what they said. That our person being there would be more risk of contamination when she's contaminated it herself and used it all up so that we can't retest it. You know, that's a concern.
Jerry, let me get this.
Form look familiar to you?
Yes,
This is something that's called a case communication record.
yes,
And what you do is when you get a phone call from somebody, you'll be jotting notes as to the gist of the conversation.
that's correct.
And did you do that in this case?
Yes,
Is that your initials at the top?
yes.
All right. Let me put this up on the Elmo, if I may. This is one of those phone messages that you got from, in this case, Mr. Fassbender, correct?
Yes,
And he says there's going to be a couple of items from the house and the garage, right?
right?
And then he says, or you wrote down, try to put her in his house or garage, correct?
Correct.
So you're being told before you do any of these tests that Mr. Fassbender wants you to come up with results that put Teresa Hallbach in Mr. Avery's house or garage. Isn't that right?
I had that information, but that had no bearing on my analysis at all.
Of course not. but that's what you're being told to do.
That was information in the investigation.
That's what Mr. Fassbender told you he hoped you would be able to do with your tests. Isn't that right?
Yeah, I assume so.
Okay. Let's go to the bullet for a minute, just to clear up a couple of things. To the eye, you didn't see any blood visible.
Correct.
So you can't really say whether the DNA on that bullet came from blood or some other source, can you?
All I can say was that it was nucleated cells.
Which could mean blood or any other source.
Right.
All right, now your lab's protocol. It recognizes that there may be some contamination in these tests, right?
Yes.
And it tells you that if you go through these tests and the manipulation control is contaminated, that you are to report it as inconclusive for match purposes.
Correct.
Now here, you ran this test on the bullet, and you got a result that showed the manipulation control was contaminated, right?
Correct.
And according to protocol, you should have not said that that was Teresa Halbach's DNA on the bullet. Your protocol told you that you were to report it as inconclusive. Isn't that right?
Yes.
And if that happens, usually what you do is you try and re-extract and run it again.
Yes.
But in this case, it was a one-time deal. You put that bullet into a buffer and you took whatever sample there was and you ran it all.
Yes.
So you could not redo the test.
That's correct.
And if the test came back inconclusive, you would not be able to put Teresa Halbach in Mr. Avery's garage at any time, right? Like Mr. Fassbender asked.
There were reasons why.
I'll get to that. My point is this. This is the only time in your entire career you have ever filed a deviation of protocol so that you could make a call and include somebody, isn't it?
The deviation that I requested was appropriate for this situation. It was okayed and it was reported.
Can I comment there, Jeff? Now, the thing is that I went through this very, very carefully. I read all the documents, etc., etc. The deviation of request form can only be utilized for exclusionary purposes. Exclusionary purposes. Cherie Cohen wanted to use the deviation request form for inclusionary purposes. In other words, to say that the genomic DNA on that bullet had belonged to Teresa Halbach. So it was inclusionary, not exclusionary. Furthermore, in order to make that form legit, she had to get her supervisor, Marie Variali, to sign it. Okay? She didn't get her supervisor to sign the form. She went to another fellow technician, I believe her surname was De Groot, in another laboratory to get it signed, which meant that the form itself was not fit for purpose. The form was illegal, right? It wasn't co-supervised, it wasn't co-signed by her own supervisor. I'm telling you right now, had Marie Variali read the blurb that Cherie Cohen wrote as a reason for why she wanted to use that deviation request form, there's no way that Marie Variali would have signed it, because that's not what the form is used for. So Cherie Cohen actually broke two laws. One, the form that she wanted was not fit for purpose. And secondly, it was not countersigned by her immediate supervisor. Now, Buting had said to her, do you realize that the form was not signed? And she goes, oh yeah, it was an oversight, right? That's like you going on a 2-week holiday and telling your colleague, I'm going to go on a holiday. Is that all right? And your colleague goes, yeah, go for it. Without telling your boss or immediate supervisor you're going on leave, right? So I cannot believe Cohen in a court of law trying to justify something which is completely unjustifiable, and she got caught out.
In all honesty, when I watched this part, when I making a murder for the first time, and even now, I think Jerry Mike drops her. Like, I think his line of questioning and the way he was able to construct it and bring it all together, I think this was one of the most effective, in my opinion, was one of the most effective cross-examinations in terms of bringing it all together and showing the jury that there was something really wrong in this case. I really do. He delivers it where if the jury were ever considering that there was a planting scenario, this was the moments where he was really tying it all back in and showing how it was all coming together, and how you could actually make that, in Ken Kratz's words, that leap. You could actually go there and go, hang on, maybe it wasn't, all the officers. It really did just come down to a few little shenanigans in the lab. Whether it was deliberate, because I think that was where the jury could kind of hide behind by thinking to themselves, okay, maybe it wasn't deliberate, but something went really wrong. So what we're getting in terms of the result isn't exactly what it really was. And they could have, not shied behind the fact that, we're accusing her as well. But I just think in terms of him delivering this point, I think he really hit it on the nail on the head with this one. I really do.
It was a masterpiece of cross questioning, but it also revealed one important point where all the shenanigans could have taken place, and that is inside the laboratory right there. And Culhane had no place to run, because she had to admit that she had contaminated the PCR negative control. She had to admit that she had utilized all the DNA sample, and the deviation request form was not fit for purpose. And don't forget that it was a butane that had uncovered that one of the laboratory technicians had to be sanctioned because they were drunk on duty. Drunk on duty, and he proved that that person, no names mentioned, had to be sanctioned at the time that the Stephen Avery case was on. Now, that truly is remarkable when you think about it.
Can you imagine that if Buting had been allowed to sort of invoke the 1985 case here, and that was taken off the table during the pretrial, right? That the defense wanted to bring up aspects of that, but they were not allowed to by the judge. Can you imagine if Buting had been able to go into Culhane and say, could you tell us about the forensic analysis that you did on Stephen Avery's hair in 1985, and how you sat there and told the jury conclusively that because of the follicular analysis or whatever the heck it was, that this hair that was found on Penny Bernstein was Stephen Avery's hair, when just a few years later than that, the FBI debunked that as reliable means of identification. Can you imagine how totally damning that would have been?
Correct. And, the stupid thing is this. Culhane had a very long history with Stephen Avery, as Big Jeff alluded to, dating back from 1985. Her crap hair analysis went a long way of putting Stephen in prison. Then, of course, came the exoneration in 2003, and now we have the same DNA analysis working on his case in 2005, right? Now, talk about a conflict of interest. If you wanted fair forensic testing, none of that forensic evidence should have been handled by Culhane or the Wisconsin State Crime Lab. It should have gone to an independent laboratory where the analyst had no idea what they were handling. In other words, it was a double-blind test. Here we had Culhane, who knew and who did all the swabbing and who brought all the samples back to her workbench. Talk about a conflict of interest, guys. You're never going to see one bigger than this.
That courts and juries and judges and lawyers and everybody else relies on, you did not disclose that in order to make that call, you had to do something so rare you've never done it before, did you?
No, I did not.
And you didn't put that in there because if you did, you wouldn't be able to satisfy Mr. Fassbender's request that you put Teresa Halbach in Stephen Avery's garage, right?
That's not correct.
Well, let's close with this. Other than that bullet, all your other tests, none of them put Teresa Halbach ever in his garage or his house or any of his vehicles, right?
Correct.
Thank you.
Now you understand the significance of item FL right then and there, because Culhane had to admit that despite extensive searching, swabbing, DNA extractions, PCR extractions, they could not find any forensic evidence of Teresa Halbach either in Stephen Avery's trailer or garage. The only piece of forensic evidence that has got genomic DNA belonging to Teresa Halbach is on that bullet, right? So apart from the RAV4, the entire 40-acre lot, they could not find Teresa Halbach's DNA anywhere but on that spent bullet under the green compressor. And it just so happened to gel with what Wiegert had asked Brendan Dassey, who shot her in the head, right? And so that's remarkable how you initially have the key in Stephen Avery's trailer, and now you have the bullet in Stephen Avery's garage. So guys, now you can see the importance, the forensic importance of item FL right there.
That's a brilliant point. And we know that Ken Kratz also referred to in his book as item FL as the game changer, right?
Correct. When he sorry, Big Jeff. When he wrote his first edition, it was the game changer. When Dr. Chris Palahniuk proved that it struck no bone, Ken Kratz was backpedaling faster than a clown on a motorcycle. You think about the timing, right? You know that I believe it was on the 27th I have to double check my notes. 27th of February, that Olsen x-rayed the cranial bone fragments and came back with the results about finding the lead flakes. February the 27th is also the same day that Fassbender and Wiegert interrogate Brendan Dassey, right? Same day that the state know about the cranial bone fragments and the beveling and the presence of lead, right? And yet, what happens a few days later on March the 1st? Wiegert tells Brendan who shot her in the head, right? And then a day later, they find item FL and item FK. Culhane analyzes item FL and finds Teresa Halbach's DNA on it. So think about this. There's a logic and a plan to item FL, because if item FL had no genomic DNA on it, that means you can't rule in Brendan Dassey, right? Someone can argue, hey, look, nothing puts Teresa Halbach inside Stephen Avery's garage. Nothing. There's no forensic evidence at all. But have a look at the importance of item FL. It now brings legitimacy to what Brendan Dassey was coerced into. So the jury's sitting there thinking, oh my God, we heard the press conference, right, on March the 2nd, on March the 1st, we heard Ken Kratz's press conference about a shooting scenario. Oh my God, they find the bullet and it's got Teresa Halbach's genomic DNA on that bullet. So the jury are putting 2 and 2 together thinking, oh my God, what happened to Teresa Halbach was real. It really did happen. She was in his trailer. She was in his garage. They murdered her, right? But if you take item FL completely out of the equation, then all you've got is hearsay and a story from Brendan Dassey. That is the importance of item FL, and the state used it to maximum effect. Of course, Dr. Chris Palanek proved that item FL never struck bone. It never went through Teresa Halbach's skull. It wasn't the instrument of death, which meant that a large part of the state's case collapsed right then and there. So now, as we'll see later on, the state has to explain how on earth did genomic DNA get on a bullet that obviously hit wood and not bone, right? So it's very embarrassing for the state. And that now explains why Kratz, it went from the game changer to I don't want to know about item FL. Unbelievable how that occurred.
Deal, and it's a good sample, then why is the rule that you should toss it?
Because I think the rule, well, I don't think anyone tossed it here. The rule is, and I think as Sherry stated, 90% of the time, 99%, it's followed. You need that guideline. You need that standard. But when you're dealing with such sensitive technology, you have to allow an element of common sense. And this clearly called for it. And Sherry made the right call. Does it happen often? No. And I think that shows the consistency and how good the scientific community is, that it's not something that has to be called upon often. There was no sample left.
Look at that face she's making. What the fuck are you talking about?
It just had no impact at all on the interpretation of Teresa Halbach's DNA profile on that bullet.
I know you feel that's clear, but it's up to the jury, 12 people sitting in that box to see whether or not it's clear.
So
this is a senior prosecuting attorney who has a scientific background looking directly at the camera and bullshitting. Any scientist, even a high school student, would be dismayed at what's coming out of his mouth. And I remember watching this. I'm not sure whether I threw my iPad or I threw something at the TV. You can't get away with shit like this. No way. And yet here he is begging for forgiveness that nothing nefarious went on. Truly remarkable.
In my line of work, when we're dealing with public presentations, we do not cite statistics that we pull out of our ass at the time. That's at 99% of the time. If you pull out a number, you better have that number very well quantified. Not pulled out of your ass. Oh, this to try and convince the people around you. If you're going to cite a number, you better have some basis.
100% correct. But the important thing here that we mustn't forget is that a contamination event took place. If a contamination event takes place, all bets are off. That's what Norm Garn should have said. All bets are off, ladies and gentlemen. We cannot draw any conclusions to the test result. How he slipped it past the judge, I've got no idea.
And we probably all understand your point. But I mean, do you really think that played very well with the jury?
Sure, I believe so. I think they can understand it. I think they're also normal, common sense people, and they're going to look back and say, yeah, it makes complete sense. She knew it was her profile, And she knew she was teaching at the time and talking. So, I mean, it all makes sense. That's what I'm trying to get across. If you want to be very rigid and say the protocol is a protocol and you can never deviate from this whatsoever, I don't think most people believe that's how life operates. That sometimes you do have to deviate just to make sense.
We're not talking about life. We're not talking about buying a used car. We're not talking about asking a girl on a date. We're talking about science.
But it actually is worse than that, guys, because we're talking about putting someone in prison for life and telling them that they're a murderer, right? Same with Stephen, and it also applied to Brendan. We're not talking about, buying some lollies at a shop. We're talking about serious scientific forensic evidence that's going to be put in front of a jury and a judge to convict someone that they had indeed shot the victim, Teresa Halbach, which means you cannot deviate. You cannot make up your own rules. You have to abide to the laws of science, laws that have been established for well over 100 years. That's exactly why we have controls. Norm Gunn saying, don't worry about that. We can, common sense can prevail here and the jury will understand. I'm still shocked to this day.
With that said, let's wrap up for today. And it's that time of the show there, Big Jeff, for you to lead off on the wrap-up comments.
Well, I think we hit this episode very hard as we went through it, and I'd only amplify Dr. Silkman's comment that from the perspective of, I think, of everybody on the panel, when we go through as much as we did, this is real. This whole episode is really about item FL. It was shadily discovered. It's that the panel actually has to debate whether or not it was planted with DNA on it, or whether or not the DNA was placed on it in the lab, because either shady event was just as likely because of the personnel present. So with regard to FL, the importance of FL and the circumstances under which they discovered it, and the dominoes that fell immediately after it were just critical boons for the state. And it's so miraculous that it happened that it's just not believable to anybody, including me. So with that, I will hand it off to my fave, Kel.
Yeah, this is as we're getting deeper and deeper into the Making a Murderer Part 1, it's going to get more hectic, and we say that every single time, but it really is. Thanks for having me. I agree. I think this is where we kind of, like I mentioned before, I'm trying to find the line of who planted what, and why. Will I find it? Maybe not. But it's for me to be able to sit back and for me to understand it. And I just hope that as we do that, we kind of view it together. I think that's what the whole motive is for us to do that, is to, bounce off each other and help each other see what could be there in front of us the entire time. Again, thanks for having me, and I'll catch us next week.
Yeah, I just want to echo what a fantastic episode, and what a great discussion by the panel. And I hope everyone in the chat has enjoyed the episode so far. And, I take this to heart a lot because I was a former scientist. I was a former molecular biologist. And even in high school, you understand the basic principles of science, and you don't deviate from them. And when you see a murder case like this, in which professional people are flouting the laws and regulations, and when they're even discarding their own laboratory protocols. And I remember finding the protocol booklet from Cherie Culhane's laboratory, and it spells out beautifully what you do when you get contamination. And the mere fact that in a court of law, she was able to somehow bend the rules and get item FL submitted into a court of law. And I believe that item FL was what ultimately hung Stephen and Brendan. It convinced the judge, it convinced the jury that the instrument of death was item FL fired by Stephen Avery. It had a devastating effect. And I implore and I beg the people in chat to do your own research, go to the primary information and see for yourself the shenanigans that took place. You simply will not believe it. Thank you very much, Jeff, for inviting me.
Thank you, Dr. Silkman, and thank you, Kelly, and thank you, Big Jeff. I hope you bring that policy or procedure book with you next week, Dr. Silkman. And
it truly is remarkable. And I've done, and Big Jeff will back me up on this, I've done probably 4 or 5 presentations on item FL and the shenanigans involved around it. And like I said, there is nothing better than utilizing the words of that person or the procedural booklets from that laboratory to show exactly how they pulled the wool over everybody's eyes. It truly is remarkable. It's all there in black and white, and they flouted the laws, they flouted the rules, and they got away with it. And that's truly shocking that now Kathleen Zellner cannot resubmit item FL because she's procedurally barred. Truly amazing.
Well, I'm glad you gave us something to look forward to. Anyway, that's it for us. Thanks everybody out there. Like and subscribe to the channel. Appreciate everything you guys do out in the comment section as well. And this has been Discussing a Murderer.